Hello, and welcome to Cross-Examination, the radio ministry of First Church of Christ in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Ryan Parrish, and I'm so happy you're joining us as we begin a series of messages that will be re-examining some ideas of great consequence. In a courtroom setting, the cross-examination is when the witnesses or the expert testimony is tested and challenged by the other side to see if it holds up. Is it trustworthy and credible? For disciples of Jesus, and anyone really, it's important that what we learn and what we hear is carefully thought through in light of what the Scriptures say. And the more we learn, the better able we are to do this. I invite you to share in my journey as we delve into some important issues that I realized require a second look. This morning we're going to be cross-examining or re-examining the popular teaching, what I think is the most popular teaching, about a series of passages of Jesus' teaching that are actually parallel to each other. These are found in Matthew 24, in Mark 13, and in Luke 21. We're going to use Matthew 24 as our guiding text only because that is the popular one, and I'm trying to address the popular way it's taught. So, I think that's the best one to use, as that's the one you're probably most likely to hear the most about in the popular teaching of this. So before I get to looking at the text with you and exploring what I think is the more accurate way to view this, I want to tell you, number one, what is the popular way it's taught, and number two, why it's worth the cross-examination. The way this text is popularly taught, especially Matthew 24, is that it's Jesus giving the signs of the end times before his second coming, his second advent. So when you hear this passage taught, you'll hear it taught in connection to other New Testament passages and even Old Testament passages with a view towards that future return of Jesus in his second coming. If you were to listen solely to those who teach it that way, it's actually very persuasive. And the language that's used in the text, when you think of it purely in light of the second coming of Jesus in the future, it sounds right. And I grew up with it, and I believed it, and to this day I'm struggling with the language used there because of how I was taught to hear the language. Not the way Jesus used it or those first disciples would have heard it as Jewish men, but the way I was taught to hear it as a modern American. Next, I want to talk about why this matters enough to deal with it, okay? I do believe Jesus is coming back in the future, his second advent, his second appearing, literally physically to earth. My contention is this text is not about that, it's about something else. Just to show you my cards ahead of time, it's about the judgment and destruction on Jerusalem that Jesus predicted in multiple ways at multiple times and most clearly here. And I'll make my case, and I hope you'll give me a chance to do so, because there's plenty here for us to wrestle through that I think will be enlightening, but here's why it matters. Jesus has been called a false prophet by people who are atheists or who are against Christianity because, in some cases, because of our failure as a church to emphasize and highlight the accuracy of his predictions about the fall of Jerusalem by the Romans ultimately, but actually the Jews of that time who were in Jerusalem were kind of destroying themselves and the city before Rome even did it. But anyway, the ultimate demise of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas in AD 70, during what is called the Jewish War with Rome, Jesus' clear and very specific predictions of that are attested to in their fulfillment by non-biblical writers of history, Josephus being the most detailed account of it. Now, Josephus was not a follower of Jesus, and yet his contemporary at the scene eyewitness testimony of what was going down, we would have a very powerful tool, not only for our own confidence in our Master Jesus and his predictions of those things, and how much more so for his predictions of things yet to come, but we get to actually say to those who are skeptics or straight out opponents of the gospel and the scriptures, how do you account for this? Jesus and his followers knew ahead of time what was coming within that generation that Jesus was teaching and living mortally. How do you account for that being fulfilled so precisely according to the word of Jesus? We can actually demonstrate with historical corroboration Jesus did speak for God. It wasn't vague and it wasn't obscure so that, well, it just looks like he predicted it. No, what we're about to look at is so clear with other texts that we have confidence in talking about Jesus, our Master, being a voice for God, and we would say the voice for God in the first century. Not only that, what we're considering has implications about the great contest between our Master Jesus and his new covenant kingdom vision of God and the corrupted way of the Jewish leadership of the time. The Jewish leadership that were the rulers at the temple, the chief priests and the high priest. There were teachers of the law, which were the scribes, and then there were the Pharisees. Now, they were all different. They were all opposed to each other in different ways, but they all came together to oppose Jesus. But when you see it all together, this clash between Jesus and the opponents of Jesus and Jesus' way, Jesus' message of the kingdom, it actually is deeply effective for us as disciples of Jesus to appreciate the covenant we have and the way in which, as awful as it was, the decisive and final judgment of God on the old hypocritical way in the destruction of Jerusalem, that actually shows us how Jesus was vindicated by God our Father and shown to be right. So, looking at Matthew 24, let's jump right into it. I'm going to read verse 1 here. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. The temple complex was massive. So the fact that this little sliver of a country with these odd people in it, with this odd God they worshipped, the fact that they had such a glorious temple was actually quite impressive. The disciples of Jesus were good, faithful Jews who shared in that pride. They shared in that sense of accomplishment for their nation, that their great God, the greatest of all gods, would have such a great temple. Now, in Mark and Luke, we actually hear what the disciples said about the buildings. Let me read Mark 13, verse 1, just because it's similar to Luke 21. It says in Mark 13:1, as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." I mean, speaking of the stones, it really is breathtaking how gigantic these stones were, and the fact that they were like one solid stone instead of a bunch of little ones put together. Absolutely astounding when you read the details about this. We totally, I think, can understand why they were proud of it and why they would point that out to Jesus. So hear what Jesus says now. Rather than sharing in the pride and the zeal, of his disciples, here's what Jesus says, and I'm going to go back to Matthew 24 now. In response, in Matthew 24:2, we read this, "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Now, again, if you know about the massive stones he's talking about, the impressive nature of these stones, the very thought that all of these stones could be separated from each other and tossed down would have been mind-boggling. and maybe even impossible to imagine. Let alone the fact that this is Yahweh's temple, right? And for this to be destroyed would be a signal of, in some way, Yahweh's defeat, it would seem. This is heart-wrenching. This would have been terrible for the disciples to hear. And for Jesus to say it means it's true. And how disturbing to the ultimate this would be for them. Well, of course, they're not going to let that go. I mean, Jesus seems to just drop the bomb and move on, right, as far as the text goes. So in verse 3 we see, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, and they say, "Tell us, when will this happen?" What is the this? It's the destruction of the temple Jesus just predicted. "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, if your translation says the end of the world, oh my goodness, you've already got a bad start to what's going on here. And of course, how could you not think this is about the end of the world before Jesus returns? But when you see what it actually says, and I'm glad the NIV got this right in the translation, the word there is age, the end of the age. Now that creates a question. What age are they asking about? One of the things that's really important to do when you're studying the Scriptures, and the Gospels clearly make this a big deal, because we know now things that those disciples at that time of Jesus' mortal ministry could not have known, could not have understood. We have the benefit of 20/20 vision looking backward. They didn't. So they were struggling to keep up with what Jesus was teaching. And you can tell that just by looking at the Gospels. Look at the record. Look at their questions. Look at their confusions, right? He's a rabbi after all. He speaks in riddles, and he speaks in parables, and he speaks in all these, metaphorical coded things. And so clarity wasn't always there for them. So anyways, when we as modern Western readers read their questions as if we were going to be asking them, we're already off on the wrong foot. When they say, "What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" if we're thinking they're asking about the second coming of Jesus and the end of the age that accompanies it, we're assuming they understand that that's going to happen. How in the world could those men at that time have conceived of the idea that Jesus was going to return to heaven and then come back from heaven to earth the way we imagine it? They don't even understand that Jesus is going to die and be raised from the dead. They don't even get that. So how could they be asking Jesus about a second coming that we now understand, but that they had no clue about? That's the first thing that somebody pointed out to me that made me say to myself, oh my goodness, what if what Jesus was talking about was their actual question and not the question I would be asking about his future return at the end of the world? Now, this is even clearer when you go to Mark and Luke. In Luke chapter 21, verse 7, this is how the question or the questions of the disciples are phrased. "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" See, in Mark and in Luke, the questions are very clear. They're very specifically about the prediction that Jesus just gave them about the destruction of the temple. Of course, that's what's on their mind. They had just heard the most devastating news, perhaps, that they could think of, which is that the temple of Yahweh is going to be destroyed utterly. And of course, that's what they want to know about. That's what they actually asked about. So when you go back to Matthew 24 and you read about the sign of his coming and of the end of the age, that language fits very well into the destruction of Jerusalem. To the ancient Jewish mind it does, not to our modern Western minds, but to their minds, that language fits very well with the destruction of the old system of things that Jesus was constantly in conflict with in the announcement and the enacting of the new way of the kingdom that has come. So just at the very outset, if you know what the question is that Jesus is answering, you can then listen to his answer and get what he's saying, which is the destruction of the temple, the signs related to it, and what those first disciples needed to know in relationship to it. So I'm going to have to go much faster than I've been going. Sorry. But that really is important. The beginning of this is so important because that's your template now for listening or reading. If you have it in your mind, they're asking about the end of the world, return of Jesus. That's how you're going to read it. If you have in your mind the destruction of the temple that Jesus had just predicted, that's how you're going to read it. And I think the destruction of the temple reading is the only one that makes sense here. So, getting into it now. First of all, in verse 4, Jesus said, "Watch out that no one deceives you." You, the apostles, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah and will deceive many. Now, if Jesus is talking about the end of the world, why would he tell those apostles to make sure that no one deceives them? Right? Remember who he's talking to, and this actually is really compelling in not being about the end of the world. You men I'm talking to right now who asked me these questions, you need to watch out that no one deceives you, because many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah and will deceive many. That means in the lifetime of the apostles, this would be happening. By the way, we have it on clear historical record, biblical and non-biblical, that that's what happened. In Israel specifically, false messiahs were rising up, and actually the report from Josephus, who again gives us the most detail about this, messiahs, false prophets were actually being paid by the different factions of Jews who were not only against Rome but against each other, being paid to make the case for rising up or not rising up. It was just like you see in the Old Testament, where different prophets are differing with each other, trying to get the people to do this or do that in response to everything that's happening in the tensions with Rome. If you remember in the Old Testament prophets, the true prophets of God would say, you better cooperate with Babylon or else you'll be destroyed. And other prophets are like, no, resist. God's on our side. Babylon can't win. Like, how can God's prophets disagree with each other? Well, it was happening then. Because false messiahs, false prophets are rising up. And it happened. I mean, Jesus' words are clear and they're true. They actually were fulfilled. In verse 6, Jesus says, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed." The tensions between the Jews and the Romans weren't new. In the time of Jesus, they were there. That's why there were zealots. And one of Jesus' own apostles was a former zealot. The Jews were never, as a nation, were never entirely comfortable having this foreign pagan power ruling them. The tensions were always there. At the end of that generation, things really escalated and heated up, and that's when, quote-unquote, the Jewish war intensified and led to ultimate disaster in Jerusalem. But when Jesus was talking about when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, that was happening. Now, to talk about this being a sign of the end of the world, to be honest, is a little unhelpful, because there's always been wars and rumors of wars. There's nothing new or unique about that would signal to us, oh, well, I guess the end of the world's almost here, because there's wars and rumors of wars. Actually, there have been periods of time where there were more wars and more rumors of wars than anything any of us could understand, because we live in a relatively peaceful time in the world. Relatively. This was something that Jesus spoke about as happening in that current generation over the next 40 years, and he was exactly right. He said, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. So, and why would he say all this? Because he's saying, you've already heard me say that the destruction of the temple's coming, but just because you hear that tensions are rising here or there, don't assume that the temple's about to be destroyed imminently. Hang in there. The end of the temple and the old system is still to come. Right around the corner there might be rumors, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It actually would take almost a full generation before Jesus' words were fulfilled. He's telling them to be patient. Don't jump the gun. In verse 7, similar idea. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. This is true. The empire of Rome stretched across the Mediterranean world, but within that empire there were kingdoms and nations under the umbrella of Rome, but there were still tensions there. And Jesus is saying, expect that. The kingdom of God has come, the gospel is here, but that doesn't mean that peace is going to descend on the world, in the next couple of years here. He says there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Again, nothing new, nothing totally out of the ordinary there. Jesus is saying, expect this is all going to be happening. By the way, this did happen in Rome, and it did happen in Jerusalem specifically and in that area in Judea. The book of Acts records a prophet named Agabus coming to a church in Antioch and telling the Christians there, through the prophetic gift of the Spirit, there's going to be a famine coming on the Roman world. And the church believed it, and they sent gifts to the Jewish Christians there in Judea and Jerusalem to help them get through it. Famine hit, and it was really bad. And the people who had enough were told by Paul and the other church leaders that you need to share it with those who don't have enough, because the famine's hitting everybody. There was not a bubble of protection around the Christians. There was just a sense of love among the Christians that allowed them to make it through. So anyways, the famines, the earthquakes, this happened in the generation following Jesus' prediction. And he's telling them in verse 8, all these are the beginning of birth pangs. God is judging his people, Israel, just like Jesus had said that God was going to do. This isn't the only time Jesus brings up the judgment of God coming on the old system of hypocritical Judaism. I was going to share all of those instances with you to kind of set it up, but it would just take so much time. But if I could share one of those instances with you that I think will make this clear. In Luke 19, verses 43 to 44, as Jesus is entering into Jerusalem in what we call the triumphal entry, right, on the donkey, as he rounds the corner and sees Jerusalem before he actually enters, it says he weeps over Jerusalem. And here's why. He says, the days will come, speaking to Jerusalem, the days will come when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another. Isn't that what he said to the disciples? They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. Again, Luke 19, 43 and 44. Jesus told a parable about tenants who were renting the land from the owner of the land. They did not give him the fruit he was owed, and so he was going to kill them and give the land to others who would give him his fruit. Over and over again, Jesus is showing that God's judgment is about to come down on this wicked generation, which he said multiple times about that generation, wicked and adulterous generation. Jesus even cursed a fig tree to enact the judgment. And when Jesus is on his way to the cross, there were women crying over him because he's suffering the way he is. And you can read about this in Luke 23, 28 to 31. Jesus says this to them, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children, a generation. For the time will come when you will say, blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if people do these things, meaning kill him, unjustly, if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? And that tree being dry is the very thing he did to that tree of figs that didn't give him the fruit he wanted. And he withered it. The only destructive miracle we know of that Jesus did. It was a prophetic sign of what was going to happen to the tree of Israel, which is a very Old Testament prophet thing to see Israel to be. And he refers to that dry tree there. And again, talking about the destruction coming on Jerusalem in that generation. All that to say, when Jesus says these are the beginning of birth pains, what he's saying is all of these things I just mentioned, the false teachers, the nations rising, the rumors of wars, the famines and earthquakes, all of that's leading up to something bigger and more catastrophic. Those are the beginnings. It's not the main event. Verse 9, you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You, meaning you apostles of mine, right here talking to me on the Mount of Olives, right? You will be hated by all nations because of me. All ethnos. Why? They're being sent to all the ethnos, all the peoples, to make disciples. They're going to be hated among all of them because they're bringing a message that conflicts with and contradicts their old systems, and there will be hatred there. Jesus already told them back in Matthew 10 when they were sent out just to the people of Israel, you're going to be hated, right? So the apostles listening to Jesus speak are being told that they personally, in connection to all of this going on, they're going to be hated. Because the conflict between Jesus and the old system is still going to be there, leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. It says in verse 10, "At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other." Why? Because the persecution's ramping up. So people that are accepting the message of Jesus and the word of the apostles, as soon as that heat of persecution intensifies, they will turn away from the faith. And again, this is what happened. This was really happening in Israel and surrounding places and throughout the Roman world as things were heating up. Paul testifies in his letters that he was chased by his own countrymen, the Jews. He's chased by the Gentiles. He's on the run everywhere he goes. So the rejection of the gospel by the old systems of the world is just the story of the church, right? So Jesus is simply warning them about that. This is going to be bad for Israel, yes, but it's going to be bad for you guys in the sense of it's going to hurt. You're going to feel the brunt of this conflict. It says in verse 11, "Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." Absolutely. The whole New Testament is filled with the testimony of that. From the book of Acts to the letters to the Revelation. The danger of false prophets has always been on the radar of any kind of decent church leadership. Again, this doesn't have to be about to the end of the world. All of this stuff is going on in that generation leading up to the demise of Jerusalem. And the apostles and early Christians needed to know. This is going to be a mess in this one generation leading up to the great birth, so to speak, to use Jesus' picture there. These birth pangs are leading up to something really tremendous. In verse 12, "Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold." Now, many people think the increase of wickedness means the world will continually get worse and worse until Jesus comes back. That's not what he said here. The increase of wickedness is as the conflict leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, as the conflict, the violence against the gospel and Christ's people is increasing. The love of most will grow cold, and it's not just the conflict against the gospel, it's the tensions all over the Roman Empire, especially in the land of the Jews. Yes, you see this happen in history. When things get desperate, people turn cold towards each other. It's every man for himself. And unless you have the Spirit of Christ in you, it's almost inevitable that happens to you. You're looking out for you and yours. What he was talking about is as things get bad and hard, people turn on each other. I don't think that's stretching anything. That's human nature, isn't it? You just watch some sci-fi post-apocalyptic movies and you know that people know this. People become kind of crazy when survival's on the line. And you definitely see that in the story of that generation. Love of most will grow cold. Where we used to be decent towards each other, we used to be friendly towards each other, we used to have, common courtesy toward each other, that's all gone now. That love is grown cold because I got to take care of me and mine. Verse 13, "But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." Stand firm how? I think of the same thing that Paul was talking about in Ephesians chapter 6, talking about the armor of God. Stand firm means stand firm against the temptations to go this way, to let your love grow cold, to turn on other people, to give in to the desperation that sets in when you feel endangered. You stand firm in the way of Christ. You stand firm in the way of love, the way of his kingdom. When you love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. When you lend to your enemies and expect nothing in return. I mean, in times of crisis, the disciple of Jesus shines brightly like the sun in the sky because we're so overcome by the love of Christ that we stand firm in that love when everyone else's love seems to be growing cold around us. Man, what a word for today. Amen. Those who stand firm to the end, not necessarily the end of the world. Why would we assume that? The end they were asking about, which is the end of the temple and all that represented. Stand firm to the end and you'll be saved. Verse 14 says, "And this gospel of the kingdom," meaning Jesus' message, of the kingdom, having come, already having come, will be preached in the whole world. And this is one of those things I mentioned where our way of understanding words as modern Western people, we need to pause a second. That word actually means the inhabited land, the civilized land of Rome, okay? So this is the same use of the word that Luke has when the entire Roman world was to be under a census from the Caesar's command or decree. Now, in the NIV, it says the entire Roman world, but in the actual Greek text, it just says the entire world. Why did the NIV insert the word Roman there? Because the word world there means the known world, not the entire planet. Now, the NIV didn't insert that here, but I think they should have. When you look at the gospel spread in that first generation of the church, you find out that according to Paul's own writings, and you go to Colossians chapter 1, you see this, Paul puts it to the Colossians that this gospel has actually gone to the world, to all the creatures under heaven. That was clearly an exaggeration. He wasn't lying. What he was doing was giving the Colossians a picture of how quickly and how effectively the gospel was spreading through the whole Roman world. And I really believe that's what Jesus was saying here. This gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of Jesus, is preached in the whole Roman world as a testimony to all the nations of the Roman world. Then the end will come. And within Paul's lifetime, he testified that that was being done. In fact, Paul had a goal. This is really interesting when you read Paul's letters with this whole, the mission in mind, the spread in mind and the strategy of it all. Paul had this goal he mentions, and it seems kind of random, seems almost like a personal life goal or something, bucket list. But he talked about wanting to go to Spain. He had this long-standing desire to go to Spain. And you're like, why Spain? What is that about? Well, that was the furthest reach of the empire that he hadn't reached yet. And he had, it seems very reasonable to think, given his task by the Master Jesus personally, to be the apostle, the voice of Jesus to the nations, the non-Jewish peoples. He wanted to make sure it got to the whole Roman Empire, and he needed to get to Spain for that to happen. Like that was the final goal for him to accomplish that task. So as far as the early church in Rome was concerned, in that first generation leading up to the destruction of the temple, it happened. Exactly what Jesus said. But not the way we would read it, because we know now a planet that the people then just didn't know. But Jesus was speaking to them in the language they understood, in the concepts they had in mind. For us to think he was talking about our concept is just not realistic. We're reading it right now, but we weren't the ones he was talking to. So moving on to verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Let the reader of Daniel understand, which would be the Jews of that time. He said, you all need to take note that the abomination of desolation that's going to be set up is a signal that it's about to go down. And there was such an abomination of desolation. Now, it's not exactly clear what Jesus had in mind there, but there are multiple things it could be. The desecration of the temple by the Jews themselves, by the way, is something I just learned about reading through Josephus' narrative with a little more care than I had before. And I realized that the factions within Jerusalem, as Rome surrounds the city in the siege, the Jews themselves are desecrating the temple of Yahweh because they're fighting amongst each other. In fact, the ancient witness says that the Jews themselves defeated themselves. Rome didn't even have to do it. The testimony of the ancient witness Josephus is that the general of the Roman army, Titus, that came to finish the job of his father, the emperor, and he was getting reports of how much chaos was going on in the city between fellow Jews. And he knew that they were destroying their own temple, setting it on fire, letting it burn. And he's like, oh my gosh, I would have let that temple stand. I wouldn't have wanted to destroy that temple, but there they go, destroying it themselves. So the abomination of desolation doesn't have to be seen as some end of the world antichrist in a newly built temple, all of this stuff. When you look at Jesus' actual words and the context he's talking about, when you see the temple being desecrated as a sign of the desolation to come, get out. This is what he said. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's verse 16. He gives them a very specific instruction. Not just if you're in Jerusalem. If you are anywhere near Jerusalem in all of Judea, you need to get out of the cities and get out of the towns. You need to go somewhere where the fighting isn't happening. Go to the mountains and hide. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. This is talking about when this cataclysmic thing is about to happen and you see it, the signs of it that I'm giving you right now. You don't waste any time. You get out of Dodge, man. You get out to the mountains like I told you to do, and don't worry about taking your stuff to make life more comfortable. You just get out and don't delay. That's his whole point. This is not about the rapture. This is about the coming destruction of the whole land at the hands of the Romans because of the Jewish war going on. And again, it's not just the Romans being brutal, though they were that. It's also the factions within the Jewish people. He says in verse 19, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Why? Why would that have to do with the end of the world specifically? It fits perfectly well with this whole issue of the turmoil and chaos and horror of the Jewish war leading up to the destruction of the temple. And by the way, it didn't end with the destruction of the temple. There was still fighting going on at Masada, if you know that story. Everything's hard in this time period, but how much harder it is when you're carrying a child. And then he says, and nursing mothers. In other words, you have these little tiny babies to try to take care of in the midst of all of this craziness, all of this violence, all of this fear. When you think about the context of what they asked him about and his answer, this is exactly spot on. And it's very understandable. He said in verse 20, pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. Why? Both of those would make it difficult to travel. If you decide, when you see the signs Jesus is giving you, if you decide on a Sabbath day or in the wintertime to take him at his word and get out of there, it's just going to be harder on the Sabbath or harder in the winter. And his whole point is you don't want any delays, whether from weather or from your Jewish sensibilities about the Sabbath day or the city gates being closed on the Sabbath day. You want a clear path out of there. Verse 21, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now this is one that people will point to, and I've heard it, and actually I had to really stop and consider it because it is a pretty compelling point. How can Jesus say that about the fall of Jerusalem, or the Jewish war generally, in light of the fact that we have seen the horrors of World War II, for instance, and the Holocaust? How can Jesus say that this is the greatest distress never to be equaled again if he was talking about that AD 70 time period? Well, as I investigated that exact question, I found out that this is actually prophetic language that I found in the Old Testament as well, that you can't hold too woodenly to in literalism, because the point isn't to say this wins, it's a competition of horror and distress, this one wins. It was the prophetic way, God's way, through his prophets, to declare this is unimaginable. You have nothing to compare this to. There's nothing that can prepare you for the horrors that you're about to experience. And again, in the Old Testament, I saw language like this, and I'm like, well, how can that be if Jesus said it and he was right about what he was talking about? The point wasn't wooden literalism, as if there's some way to compare distresses on some meter and this one wins and that one loses, right? So I got to move on, but look into this. Look into the language of this. I was reading one text in the Old Testament that talked about an army that was so large, even in the distant future and ancient times past, there was nothing to compare to this army. Well, if you take that literally and then think of Revelation where there's a 200 million man army, if you take that literally, it's kind of like, well, they lied back in the Old Testament. No, they didn't. It's that language of just huge numbers and overwhelming and intimidating and unimaginable. That's the way the prophets speak. And so to hold Jesus to this wooden literalism just doesn't make sense for the way prophets speak, and he's being a prophet. Verse 22 says, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Again, you'll hear this commonly, most commonly, spoken about the days of the Great Tribulation at the end of the world. Again, I implore you, think about how this applies to the days of the judgment on Jerusalem and Israel generally. There were the righteous Jews. Isn't that true? There were those who embraced Messiah. There were those who embraced the way of the kingdom. And for the sake of the elect, God was not going to let this play out the way it could have if he totally withdrew himself. He cut it short, and he showed grace and mercy even in his judgment, which again is a very Old Testament prophetic promise about God's judgments. There would always be a remnant and an elect that he would keep in his mind and his promises made to them. And so, absolutely it fits the story of the first generation of the church leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 23, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. Now, by the way, as you read this history, you're going to see that the claims of messiahship are actually growing in this time period, because anytime, and by the way, you'll see it right now in the year 2020 because of the craziness going on, anytime chaos rises in the world, it's prime time for would-be messiahs, because everyone's thinking about the end of the world. Everybody has somewhere back in their mind going, all right, this is nuts. Everything that's going on right now is crazy. Something big and cosmic must be going down. And so as soon as people pop up saying, I'm the Messiah, God's sent me with a message, God's going to use me to save you, people will listen. They're desperate. We see it in America on the political side of things as well as the religious side of things. I'm investigating the book of Revelation and other things of eschatology as we study as a church, and I'm listening to certain teachers of prophecy, Bible prophecy, and I see the zeal and devotion of their listeners as if they have all the answers, and people are wanting that in times of chaos. So yeah, when Jesus says false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect, that happened. I mean, read the historical records. I would love, if we had so much more time, I'd love to read these historical records to you, but they're accessible to you. You can go online, you can check out the book from the library, read these things in Josephus, read these ancient texts, read the New Testament, and you see that this is true. I mean, even Simon Magus in the book of Acts, he had actual sorcerer power, and he had persuaded people that he was the great power. We have it in our own scriptures that this was real and going on, real power to deceive real people. Jesus says in verse 25, see, I have told you ahead of time. You disciples in the first century who are asking me this question, you, my apostles, I've told you, you shouldn't be falling for this stuff. You know too much now. I've given you the heads up. Others may be fooled, others may not know better, but you do, so don't you dare. Even if they show you really convincing signs, don't you fall for it. Besides, these men would have the true signs of the gospel, wouldn't they? They should know how to discern the spirits because they were given the true authority to do great signs and wonders themselves. Verse 26 says, so if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, or don't go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. This may be where we have to end it, I don't know. But if we could look at this language of the coming of the Son of Man, because it connects us to verse 30, where it says, there will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And all the peoples of the earth, which actually should read their tribes of the land. And the NIV tells you that in a footnote, and I wish they would have put that in the actual translation in the text. The tribes of the land, which clearly speaks to Israel, because tribes is used, that word for tribes in the Greek is used almost exclusively of Israel throughout the whole New Testament. The tribes of the land, not all the peoples of the entire planet, the tribes of the land will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and glory. Of course, the way we've been taught, that sounds like Jesus' second coming. Because he is going to come the way he left, just like the angel said when he left. He went up into the sky, and the disciples watched him until a cloud hid him from sight. And angels were there to say he's going to come back the way he left. So yeah, we get that. He's coming on the clouds back to earth one day. But that's not what this is saying. This is a reference to Daniel 7, when Daniel had a vision of one like a son of man going to the Father, called the Ancient of Days in that vision, on clouds, and he was receiving power and authority to rule the peoples of earth. The Son of Man coming on the clouds isn't coming to earth, our perspective. It's coming to God at his throne in heaven perspective. This Daniel 7. And Jesus is using the language of a prophet that these Jewish men who are asking him this question would recognize. And this is made even more certain when you think about what Jesus said to the Sanhedrin during his trial. When the high priest asked him point blank, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus said, "You have said so." And Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give us this with a little difference in wording, but Jesus said, "From now on, you," talking to the Sanhedrin, "you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, if he meant his second coming, he straight up lied, because those men in the Sanhedrin at that time died a long time ago, and they never saw the second coming. They never saw Jesus coming to earth on clouds. He wasn't talking about that. He was talking about going to the Father to receive what Daniel 7 portrays, which is the authority to rule all the peoples. This is Matthew 28 in the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Now, why did Jesus say they would see it? Because they were going to see the proof of it when Jerusalem fell. Their power structure, their place of dominion was the temple and the Jewish religion of that time. And Jesus said, you're going to see from now on, you're going to see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. What they saw was the destruction of the temple and their whole order. That's what they saw. And according to Jesus, that was the signal to them that he had indeed done what he said he would do, which is to sit down at God's right hand, and that he would have received all that power and authority, according to the prophecy of Daniel. See, all of this makes so much more sense in light of the fall of Jerusalem than it does the end of the world stuff. Now, you might say, what about verse 29 where it talks about the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken? Oh, man, if I had more time, I'd look at each of these texts with you, but let me just give some to you. Isaiah 5:30, Isaiah 13:10, Isaiah 24:23, Ezekiel 32:7, Joel chapter 2 verse 10, Joel chapter 2 verse 31, Joel chapter 3 verse 15. This is a common and understood way for the prophets speaking for Yahweh to communicate the fall or destruction of a great world power. Sometimes it was Israel, sometimes it was Babylon, sometimes it was Egypt. It was the fall of an earthly power, and always at the hands of a foreign power from a faraway land. So Jesus is using very prophetic language from the Old Testament to describe the same scenario that's about to be played out in their generation. A great power, which is the Israel temple structure and temple religious program, was going to be brought down and humbled and desolated by a foreign power from a faraway land. Well, guess who that is? That's Rome and the forces of Titus. Look at those texts. Look at the same language of the celestial bodies turning dark and the stars falling. It's also in Revelation. This is about earthly powers, earthly structures that people have come to depend on and rely on being totally wiped out, and their sense of chaos and out of control taking over. That's what this is all about. That's what these symbols mean. If you read this and you're thinking that the sun's going to turn black and the moon's going to turn black and they're literally not going to shine anymore and the stars are literally going to fall out of the sky, if that's what you're looking for to tell you Jesus is coming back, that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the power structures. He's using Old Testament prophet language that they would have understood. Finally, and this is perhaps one of the hardest verses that I had to try to grapple with because it sounds exactly like language of the second coming and the rapture kind of thing. It says in verse 31, he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call. Who's he? The Son of Man, right? He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect, a word he's already used, from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. This is, again, Old Testament prophetic language, the gathering of the elect who have been scattered. If you're thinking of this as the rapture when Jesus sends out the angels, like he describes in the parables of Matthew 13, sends out his angels to gather the elect or to gather up the wicked and cast them into the fire, I totally get it. I see that too. And this is, again, where I had to rethink it. But it doesn't not fit into the first century scenario we've been talking about this whole time. The word angels means messengers. And admittedly, it's almost always about the supernatural beings that are angels to us. But the word angel means messenger, and it doesn't always have to mean supernatural being from heaven. It can mean a human messenger as well. And so even in Revelation 2 and 3, when Jesus is sending a message to the 7 churches in what we call Turkey, and he says, write to the angel of the church of, it doesn't necessarily mean write to the supernatural being in that church. It could mean the messenger taking this message or the one reading the message out loud to the church. So what if we read it like this? The Son of Man will send his messengers with a loud trumpet call, which again doesn't have to be literal. What does trumpet call represent? A call to action. It's what you do in the army to tell this large group of soldiers what to do next. It's what Moses had done in Israel to tell the people of the different tribes to get up and start moving because the cloud's on the move. This is just the way you would speak of a signal being sent out to a lot of people of what to do. It's marshaling the troops, so to speak. So for Jesus to say he will send out his messengers with a loud trumpet call, couldn't that just as well speak of the messengers of Jesus and his gospel going out? What? To do what? To gather his elect, the ones who believe the message of the kingdom, who embrace the Messiah, from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now this would be distinct from what he had said previously about the whole Roman Empire. Is it possible that this indicates that the gospel will go even beyond the Roman Empire throughout the whole planet? When? After these things occur. And he will send. This is at the tail end of the whole story. As if to say, gentlemen, the destruction of the temple isn't the end of everything. My gospel work will carry on and even go beyond what you yourselves will do. And see, this is what's really interesting. Jesus doesn't speak of them doing it. He speaks of the messengers doing it. They were his messengers for that generation. But Jesus seems to be telling them, even after the destruction of the temple, the Son of Man is going to send out his messengers to the furthest lengths to gather in those who belong to God, who believe the kingdom message, who embrace Messiah. From there, he goes on to talk about, these are the signs, take it to heart. I'm going to have to end it there. It takes a really long time to work through a section like this, but I hope this helps you see Jesus was a prophet who was so accurate about what his disciples in the first century could expect and how to respond. And let me conclude here. This matters because the disciples of the first century knew Jesus was talking about this, and they actually did what he said. They got out. They went, many of them, to a place called Pella. This is historical. This is not in the Bible, but you can look at the history of this. The Christians en masse went to a place called Pella, knowing the destruction of Jerusalem was coming, and the number of Christian Jews who died in the Jewish war compared to the non-Christian Jews is astounding, the difference, because the Christian Jews took Jesus at his word and listened to him, and the ones obviously who didn't think he was prophet or Messiah didn't listen to him, and the consequences were clearly different for the two groups. This matters, brothers and sisters, and that's why I bring it to you. There are plenty of things in the scriptures about the end of all things when Jesus returns. Look to those and think on those for that. But for this text, marvel at the clarity of Jesus and the certainty of Jesus about what was going to be coming in about 40 years from the time he said it, and how exactly spot on he was about it. He warned his generation, just like prophets throughout the story of Israel warned their generations about what God was going to do to punish them. Now, our job, right here and now, is to warn people what we know about is yet to come for us. Let us be faithful to our task, just like Jesus was. We don't have the same prophetic gifting that he does, clearly, but we have enough of the truth about what's ahead of us that we can help people see it. We can help them respond well to it. And so look to the other scriptures that talk about those things. Use this scripture to give you confidence that when Jesus says something's going to happen, it will, because he got it right in AD 70. And we know that he and his apostles are right about what is yet to come with his second coming. Amen. Be encouraged. That concludes this morning's message, and I hope it was an encouragement to you and reminds you of the greatness of Jesus and the greatness of his love for you. Before we go, I want to invite you to join us each Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m. as we gather as a church family here at 1437 Tyrone Pike in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania. If you're a follower of Jesus, we'd love to continue to minister to you and help you become more like him, as well as invite you to minister to us with the gifts the Holy Spirit has given you. If you're someone who's still investigating what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and why you should follow him, we would love to help you in that process as well. We also welcome you to visit our website at fcocpa.org, where you'll find many resources, both video and audio, that are designed to help you understand and follow Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you until next time. Bye-bye.